Welcome to Global Response, where the climate crisis meets global opportunity. I'm excited because today, instead of interviewing a guest, we're going to hear directly from Jonas Stein, the founder of Climate Response. He's going to share why this podcast exists and why climate tech has a bright future outside of the United States. How did you get started in climate, and what led you to start Climate Response? I first started thinking about a career in environmental protection when I was a junior in high school in Virginia. The local power company proposed building 2 nuclear power plants a few miles from my house, and my mother joined a group of around 100 people in the county who were fighting against it. I immersed myself in the arguments against nuclear power and went to weekly meetings where we discussed how to stop the plans. It was an uphill battle, but eventually we were able to get the proposal canceled. It took a lot of hard work, and we may have been helped by an incident that took place at a place called 3 Mile Island. After TMI, nuclear power stopped being an issue, but a career as an environmentalist became my destiny. In 1986, I spent 6 months researching the Superfund, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980, for my senior project at Antioch College. I wrote the paper, I handed it to my professor to talk about it, and he pointed out that I really didn't have a conclusion. And he was right. I had to think about this for a minute and what the law was supposed to do versus what it had actually done. And I realized that by 1986, only a handful of sites had been, quote, remediated, and that meant being capped with clay and a few monitoring wells installed. Even 40 years later, the only sites that have been fully remediated are where the value of the resulting real estate justified the investment. That realization shaped my climate thesis. Effective climate solutions need to harness the energy and creativity of capitalism. We need climate-positive solutions which reduce emissions and let people make money. Because as soon as the business model is proven, resources are only limited by the return on investment. The other fact that underlies my thesis is that the U.S. political system has repeatedly promised we're on the threshold of actually doing something about it. In 1988, George Bush campaigned as the environmental president. He put climate change front and center in his campaign and told us he was going to be a new kind of president, one that was an environmental Republican. There's a great documentary called The White House Effect, which tells this story better than I can. But 3 decades ago, the world was poised to stop global warming. These efforts were undermined by a faction led by John Sununu, who was chief of staff under George Bush. He conspired with the fossil fuel industry to replace climate action with a well-funded climate denial. John Sununu changed the course of history. In the 1990s, we finally saw climate legislation. The Climate Change Action Plan, which promised to respond to the threat of climate change and move the U.S. economy towards environmentally sound economic growth into the next century. Great sounding platitudes, but a weak build focused on voluntary participation and global partnerships. There were some wins, particularly in energy efficiency. Energy Star ratings were real progress and drove many manufacturers to have highly efficient appliances, if only to compete. But overall, it was a fail. And the biggest fail was that by talking about global partnerships, they created a framework that climate delayers and deniers could use to shift the conversation to talk about India, China, and the developing world, and to pretend that the United States didn't have a huge role to play in climate solutions. The 21st century began with an oil man named George W. Bush Jr. being appointed as president, and the U.S. spending trillions of dollars and another decade fighting over foreign oil fields. We called it the global war on terrorism. 2006 told us an inconvenient truth and sparked a resurgence in the U.S. climate movement, and 2015 gave us Paris. But another thing happened over those 3 decades. My destiny as an environmentalist detoured into making a living. I spent a decade in sales before I got involved with this new phenomenon called the World Wide Web, and got propelled into the world of online marketing. The first actual sign of climate success I saw came from one of my clients, a company called Sunrun. They combined Wall Street financial instruments with net metering to create a business model for leasing rooftop solar. They called it solar as a service. Essentially, Sunrun customers entered into a power purchase agreement to buy electricity generated by solar panels installed in their home. These power purchase agreements are bundled together and sold on Wall Street as collateralized debt obligations. The depreciation is bundled separately and sold, as are the solar tax credits. Their business model made solar competitive and provided the scale they needed to grow. By 2018, the cost of home solar dropped enough for us to buy a system without a lease. Sunrun is currently the largest installer of residential solar in the United States, and proved that when you put the business model together, consumers will flock to alternatives, provided it costs less money. Decades of failed attempts at political solutions have nurtured my climate capitalism thesis. When I left UNS Project, my last startup attempt in 2023, I decided to pivot from digital privacy and security and return to my undergraduate environmental ambitions. 40 years later, the insight that regulations will work better when they're aligned with capitalist ambition led me to launch Climate Response. Because regulations aren't enough, we need to rapidly develop climate solutions at a global scale. My mission is to focus on the 100 categories of shovel-ready climate solutions offered by Project Drawdown and identify where they're being supported by national industrial policy around the globe. This podcast is the next step. It's a reaction to what's happening in Washington and is intended to inspire a generation of people seeking meaningful careers addressing the climate crisis, to connect with people, policies, and markets that are striving to guarantee our future.